Hi, everyone, and welcome to the only podcast we're going to have for the intelligence units. Like I said, I'm going to try to do basic intelligence, the most important ideas and concepts from the chapter, and it not only covers the idea of intelligence, but also intelligence testing. So let's begin. First things first, what is intelligence, right? This can be debated, but in general, we have an idea of what intelligence should include. So it's mental abilities needed to select, adapt, and shape our environment. It involves learning from experience, solving problems, reasoning, and successfully meeting challenges and achieving goals. That's a huge definition. So obviously, intelligence can be looked at in a lot of different ways. Okay, here's 4 of the most common ways that we think of to look at intelligence. So the first way is by a guy called Charles Spearman. And really what he believes is that you either have it or you don't. This is like, he calls it the general intelligence or G factor. And it's literally like you're smart or you're not. There's not different types of intelligence, there's just one. Sternberg has 3 types. He says that people can be analytical, which is like traditionally what you would think of, like kind of school smart. Then there's creative, which is something maybe that we talked about the other day with the circles test, like being creative. So there's a creative intelligence, and then there's a practical intelligence. And this might be described as more like street smarts. So he thought that people could be 3 types of intelligence, and there are highs and lows in every category. Howard Gardner then took 3 types and made it 7, and now actually it's 8, right? And here's the 8 on the side, and examples of people who are high and low in these traits. Now remember, just because you might be intelligent in this area, it's not the same as learning in that area. So lots of people are like, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner. That's not actually true. That's like an incorrect use of Gardner's theory. Gardner just thought that people could be have like higher aptitude in one area over the other. So some people are like really good at music, but maybe not so good with relating to other people. Or they're really good with reading, but not so great with math. So that's what he would say. And the last type is more like it's a newer type of intelligence. It's getting a lot of press lately. It's called your emotional intelligence or your EQ, okay? And this is understanding and managing your feelings and the feelings of others. So it's knowing how you feel and being able to tell how others feel. Another thing about this is delaying gratification. So wanting to do something, but knowing that if you do it now, you'll have to, you won't get to the end result. In other words, going out with your friends instead of staying home and doing your AP Psych homework because you want to do well on the AP test, right? So you have to be able to delay that gratification of going out with your friends in order to get the long-term goal, okay? And they test this by a marshmallow test, not the one we did in class, and I'll show you tomorrow. Okay, so how do we measure intelligence? All right, the intelligence testing is very controversial, obviously, because not everyone agrees on what intelligence is. But most psychologists currently view intelligence as a normally distributed trait. That means it follows the bell curve, right? And it can be measured on tasks that you're given. So the origin of testing comes from Sir Francis Galton, and he founded psychometrics, which is the science of measuring your mental abilities. And he pioneered the use of intelligence surveys, and he used this to try to like do selective breeding or eugenics. So if you like did well on the intelligence testing, they would encourage you to breed, and if you didn't, they would try to push you, away and not breed, and then get like a supreme society. This is kind of a lot of these ideas were like intermixed with Nazism. So this isn't not like a very pretty side of psychology, right? And we obviously don't use it for this today, but this is what it was once upon a time. So the first real intelligence test was in 1908, and the French government everyone had to go to school, so they wanted to figure out which kids should go in what grade. So they had Alfred Binet, not Binet, Binet, developed a test to identify intellectually deficient kids that could be placed in lower level classes. In 1916, Stanford psychologist Louis Terman released the Stanford Binet. So basically, he took the French test and made it into an American test, called it the Stanford Binet test. It could be used with the teens and adults. The Stanford Binet test was used in developing some of the first tests that they used to test for Army. So the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, which are used to classify recruits and to test recruits. And still today, if you want to go into the Army, the Marines, whatever, you have to take the ASVAB, right? Which is it's a test to measure your intelligence and your skills and your aptitude to give you different levels of what you can go into. So the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale is the most respected of the new American intelligence tests. In America, testing became widespread after this intelligence test was released. Like I said, Army recruits, it was used on immigrants and school children, which is what we think of testing most often. There's another test that's pretty popular. It's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's now currently the most used intelligence test in our culture. It has an overall score, and then it breaks that down. So it has that G, which is like your overall intelligence, and then a verbal and a performance. performance. And then the verbal and performance also break down into 11 different subtests. So this really gives us a more detailed picture of what skills you're high and low in, not just one score. So here's some examples of what's on the Wechsler. I will do some of these in class, but you can take some time and kind of look through them. They're all different categories of things. Okay, so the Stanford-Binet originally measured a person's intelligence quotient by a certain like the formula, right? So your IQ was your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. So if my mental age was 10 and my chronological age was 8, right? That would give me, and then times 100, I'd get a 125. And if you were exactly on par with your age, you end up with 100. So if my chronological age is 15, my mental age, which is the score I get on the test, is 15. I divide it, I get 1 times 100, it's 100. So if your mental age is above your chronological age, you're above 100. If your mental age is below it, you're below 100. Now the problem is that the mental age, right, and the chronological age, as you get older, you don't actually get smarter, right? You kind of like level out, especially we talk about the difference between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized a lot of times is not measured on this, it's fluid. So as an adult at 30, 35, my mental age might still be a 20-year-old. All of a sudden I'm 35 now and my IQ goes down when really it's still the same. So they have a new formula now where they use the standardized bell curve. Okay, so we don't use this formula anymore, but we used to. Other types of tests that you should know, that there's aptitude and achievement tests. So aptitude tests are meant to predict your future performance. The ACT, the SAT, the GRE. Achievement tests are meant to measure what you've learned. So the AP exam is an example of an achievement test. Final exams, achievement test. I'm measuring what you've learned, not what you can do in the future. Okay, so what do these tests really measure, and how do we know that they're actually legitimate tests? So in order for an intelligence test to be legitimate, it has to have the following 3 things: standardization, reliability, and validity. Test standardization. What they do is they take the test and they give it to a whole bunch of people before you ever see it. They give it to a representative group of kids. Let's take something like the ACT. They give it to a bunch of kids and they make them take it, and then they take their scores, and they're not actually taking it for real. Like, they don't get a test score. And then they calculate their scores and they figure out the bell curve. So for example, when you get a 26 on the ACT, that 26 doesn't mean you got 26 points right? What they've done is they take your score on the ACT and compare it to the first group, and then they put you in the bell curve and you get your percentile rank, right? So it looks something like this, right? They would put all of the scores in this bell curve, and then they decide the middle score on the ACT might be a 21. So if you score above it, how much above it? 23, 25, 27, right? All the way up here, you might be 30, 31, 32, 36 range, all the way down here to the bottom range, okay? You've seen this curve before. It's the standard bell curve, and they use it for intelligence tests. They use it for any testing a lot of times because it just makes a normal distribution, all right? And in an IQ test, the mean is always 100. The standard deviation is always 15. So the average IQ is 100, like I said, standard deviation is 15. So 68% of people are 1 standard deviation, 85 to 115. 2.5 are above that, over 130. 2.5 are below that. So that's the mentally deficient, impaired. And actually, they use the word mentally retarded, but we're not really using that anymore. It's more intellectually disabled. People have under 70, and then less than 5% or less than 0.5% are near genius. So they're over 140. Okay, and what they found is something called the Flynn Effect, and this is the idea that over time our intelligence scores have risen on the whole. Have risen on the whole, and so this is called the Flynn Effect, that we keep getting smarter, but we don't really know why. Okay, so validity is another thing you need, right? Validity is if the test is valid. Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? If I give you a test in AP Psych and AP Chem, my test is not valid. It doesn't measure your AP Psych knowledge. It's not fair. So there's 3 types of validity. Face validity is does it look like it measures what it's supposed to measure? So if I'm giving you a test to see if you're depressed, if you as the person taking the test, does it seem like the questions are about depression? That's called face validity. Does the person taking the test think that the test is actually measuring what they think it's measuring? Do the questions seem to go along with what they're thinking about? Content validity is now actually if the questions really do measure depression, right? So granted, I could make a test that didn't really look like it measured depression, but it might actually. So it wouldn't have face validity, but it would be content validity. But normally those two go together. If it looks like it measures it, it usually does measure it, right? So content validity is if I give you a test for AP Psych for motivation and emotion, it's on motivation and emotion. It's not on intelligence. That wouldn't be the right content. And then predictive validity. This is from that driver's ed question from the beginning of the term. This is asking if the test can predict future performance. So something like a driver's test, if it has high predictive validity, it would prove that you can drive well in the future. If not, it's not a good predictor of whether or not you're a good driver, okay? And the last thing you have to know for test construction is reliability. And this is, if someone's reliable, they're always there for you, right? So test construction and reliability, it's always the same. You always get the same test score. And the way that they do this is they do a test retest. So they make the same group of people take the test twice, and they should get around the same score. And they also split the test in half, evens and odds, and they see if you did about as well as the evens as the odds. The evens should not be much harder than the odds, and the odds shouldn't be much easier than the evens or whatever. They should be equally as hard in order for the test to be reliable. So these are all just pictures I found, different cheating examples that I thought were interesting. We can talk more about this in class and cheating. So a couple of more things about intelligence. Like I already talked, there is very high and very low, right? Most of us are in the middle, but there is high and low. So here's a chart of the different percentages of degrees of mental retardation, or what we would call it now, intellectual disability, right? All the way from mild to profound. Okay, mental retardation, it's a generalized disorder, cognitive functioning, and it begins before the age of 18. It's historically defined as an IQ under 70, and now it's known as an intellectual disability. Okay, the other end of the scale is giftedness, and it's the upper 2% of the IQ range. And you can even become part of a society if you're gifted. It's called the Mensa Society, and I'll give you an example of one of those tests, what they look like in class. And last but not least, there are people who tend to have below average like intelligence in some areas, but they have remarkable talents in other areas. And an example of this is that Stephen Wilshire that I showed you, where he was, had problems communicating with others, but was that amazing artist that could see something and then draw it all from memory. Okay? So a lot of times psychologists say that genetics are heredity, right? They're given to you by your genetics. Some of them say that it's your environment, what food you have, how much money your family has, and what kind of education you go to, right? But what we find overall is that identical twins reared together have the most similar IQ scores, so genetics are very important. Okay. Research shows that twins and adopted children, genetic differences really matter, and genetic differences are important in intelligence, and intelligence is partially genetic, right? But it's also shown that any kind of racial or class differences in IQ scores can be eliminated by changing the environment. So a lot of times it's not about racial or class, it's about the environment. Lower socioeconomic groups tend to do poor on IQ tests, not because they're not as smart, but because they maybe don't have the same nutrition, or they don't get read to as often because their parents are working 2 and 3 jobs, or a lot of other factors that come into play. And so for a long time, people have used IQ scores because some minority groups tend to score lower as a way to say that those minority groups are not as smart. Like this guy here, Africans are less intelligent than Westerners. That's obviously totally false, right? It has nothing to do with being African, African American, or any other minority group. What it is that tests are biased. They're written by generally white males, so they tend to be questions that have to do with white male culture, which not all other cultures really know about. And also, a lot of times in our society, we've made it so a lot of minorities end up being in a lower socioeconomic status because of where we force them to be, and then they don't have as much access to education and other things. So that's all for now, AP Psychos. And remember, psychology is flippin' awesome. Hey.
You're talking to the student, you're doing your flip.